There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. Yeah, something sure is happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. And Retake Our Democracy in this radio show, in its blog, in its Zoominars, and in its statewide alert system, tries to keep you informed, keep you motivated, keep you activated so that you can do something about what's going on. Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Last week, I interviewed Greg Mello, director of the Los Alamos Study Group, and he's been the director there since 1992, so he knows his stuff. We had a wide-ranging discussion that covered the history of LANL's involvement in the nuclear arms development in the nation and the frightening increases in that role that are being proposed right now. The week before that, I spoke with Lovelace Johnson III, the co-founder of the New Mexico Alliance for Justice, and we spoke about the recent protests at the Santa Fe Plaza and in Albuquerque, as well as plans to organize not just for police reform, but for other justice-related issues. And you can listen to both of those shows and all of our previous shows and watch them by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, hovering over the action and events in the menu bar, and you'll find Retake Conversations, and click on that and bingo, you're in, and you can watch any of the shows. Today I'm speaking with Laura Ives and Jeff Haas. And Laura is the former legal director for the ACLU, also a former public defender, and now is a partner at Civil Rights Law in Albuquerque. And the law firm is representing Scott Williams, who was shot by Steven Baca on videotape at the June, I believe it was June 10th protest. And Jeff is a Santa Fe attorney who represented the family of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther from Chicago, who was murdered by Chicago police with a big assist from the FBI. And that was back in June of 1969, I think. And since then, he's made a career of representing clients in a wide range of racial and environmental justice contexts, including representing those arrested at Standing Rock. Before we get started, I want to remind our listeners that Retake will be moderating yet another Zoominar. We have a Zoominar on the Health Security Act with Mary Feldblum, and she's the director of the Health Security for New Mexicans campaign. Shelley Mann-Lev, the co-chair of the New Mexico Public Health Association. Tyler Taylor, and he is a doctor. And we're also hoping to have one member of the New Mexico State Senate. On July 21st, we'll be hosting a panel with Kathleen Burke and Dick Mason from Fair Districts, New Mexico, and a lobbyist and board member for the League of Women Voters. Joining them will be New Mexico Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino, hailing from Albuquerque, and Senator Mark Moores, also, I believe also from Albuquerque, and he's a Republican. We will be discussing what the process will be for doing redistricting when it begins and what is at stake and how you can maybe chime in. But so those are all the announcements. So let's get started. Welcome, Laura and Jeff. And for our radio folks, you don't realize that we did 2/3 of the show and I realized I'd messed up, and so we had to restart. So this is take two. I like to let our guests introduce themselves. So maybe Laura, you can go first and tell us how you got into criminal law and into more specifically civil rights litigation.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us this afternoon to talk about these important issues. I went to law school intending to be a criminal defense attorney. I have a very deep and abiding respect for those who stand in the way of the immense power of the state and anyone who's been criminally accused. When I did that work about 20 years ago now, I realized for a variety of reasons that I wanted to address the systemic problems. When doing that work, I saw that it was absolutely acceptable for officers to lie in court. And even when they were clearly caught doing so, there was no accountability for that. And I also worked, we criminalize all sorts of actions, mainly related to poverty, that should not be criminalized. And working within that system was frustrating. So I decided to do work on the system more and do more impact litigation. And I've done constitutional law ever since. I worked on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell separation pay. I've worked on same-sex marriage in New Mexico, physician aid in dying. I've represented many estates of persons who were killed by law enforcement. I represent many women who were raped by men in positions of authority.
Okay, well, you certainly have a varied resume there in that form of litigation. Jeff, how about you? How did you get into this game?
Well, I was in law school in Chicago in the 1960s, and I wasn't sure quite why I went to law school, but there was so much happening there, and I got exposed to what was going on in Chicago. I took a job at Legal Aid and working with Black community organizations, and I saw the frustrations they were up against trying to make systemic change. And then when Dr. King was killed, there were riots in Chicago, and they were just picking up every Black kid they could, even if they were just on the streets. So a friend of mine, somebody I met that night, we volunteered, went down to the police station and helped get some of these kids out on bail. And I think that bond is what started. A year later, we started the People's Law Office in Chicago with more lawyers, and our objective was to defend the movement at that point. The Panthers said, we're getting harassed every time we sell a newspaper, we need people's lawyers. So the Panthers and the Young Lords and the Young Patriots, our Appalachian group, and the anti-war movement needed criminal defense lawyers because the cops were harassing them all the time. 3 months later, Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed on December 4th, 1969, and my law partners and I spent the next 13 years proving that it was an assassination, that the cops who murdered him not only lied about what happened, but they were put up to it by the FBI. And so my history is somewhat in criminal defense, but also a lot in civil rights suits, justifying or trying to defend victims of police murders, police brutality. In Chicago, we even exposed a police torturer who was routinely torturing people, Black suspects, to get confessions of a man named John Burge. In this situation, I've been asked by some of the witnesses to the shooting of Scott Williams to represent them because people are very anxious that Baca be prosecuted. But I'll turn that over back to Laura about what happened.
Okay, well, we'll get to that. One of the things, there's a lot of nested issues here. One of them is just the extent of vigilantism in New Mexico and across the country, and Baca and these people who feel like they have to take the law into their own hands. And then there's the performance of the Albuquerque police, and then how that extends out into a systemic problem across the country. So we'll just start by taking a look at the case at hand, the Steven Baca assault on Scott Williams. And so, Laura, do you want to describe how you got involved in this and a little bit about how the police response or lack thereof?
Sure. So on June 15th, there was a peaceful prayer vigil at Higuey Park in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that park is adjacent to the Albuquerque Museum, which has in front of it a statue of Don Juan Oñate, which has been controversial since it was installed. So this prayer was a call for a righting of a historical genocide, and certainly the celebration of it through this art installation and prayer for removal of it. And so the demonstration was very peaceful. There was no police presence, at least visibly so, throughout the demonstration. After the vigil concluded, some of the attendees turned their attention to the physical statue. And At that time, armed militia members who were in attendance became more apparent to the crowd and became more, they were escalating the situation. They believed it their role to take control, but there were accounts of them bumping into people and then backing up and saying, "Oh, I fear for my life." And so people were growing concerned, and they called the Albuquerque Police Department, and the Albuquerque Police Department never responded. At the same time, the gentleman who ultimately shot Scott Williams in the back multiple times, he was agitating the crowd. He was careening through the crowd, battering people indiscriminately. And then there were a few people he turned his attention to, specifically 3 women. And he pulled them down and knocked them down. After the last woman was on the ground holding her head in the fetal position, 2 members of the crowd started to go after him. He just seriously hurt a woman. And Mr. Baca pulled out mace, at some point pulled out a gun. My client, Scott Williams, saw that he had a gun out and was wrestling with 2 other people who he does not know, and attempted to disarm Mr. Baca. He was unsuccessful, and Mr. Baca shot him in the back multiple times as he was running away. It was only after the shooting that the Albuquerque Police Department responded and actually arrived on scene. They were behind the museum. They were in the museum surveilling this, and yet allowed all of this to happen and allowed kind of control of the scene. They ceded it to the militia. So when they arrive on scene, they did not secure it as they would with any other potential homicide. They did not ensure the evidence remained in place. They did not interview witnesses who were trying to come forward to them to tell them what they observed. Some of the SWAT officers, apparently, their video cameras, their lapel videos, are obscured, so the video evidence has even been damaged. And reports are that they then, instead of doing all of this and ensuring accountability for Mr. Baca going forward, they instead tear gassed the crowd and shot them with rubber bullets.
This isn't the first time for Albuquerque. There appears to be a real problem in the department in terms of lack, and you mentioned this, Laura, lack of transparency and accountability. What's wrong with the culture and the way that law enforcement is practiced in Albuquerque? And Jeff, maybe you can chime in with some of what you've spoken to me about the overcharging, undercharging, and also just in this context, the reluctance of witnesses to step forward. How is all that interwoven?
Laura, you want to start with the Albuquerque police and I'll pick it up?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, I don't think that the Albuquerque Police Department is unique with some of its problems. I mean, there's a culture nationally of us versus them mentality. The training reflects that, and officers oftentimes don't see themselves as serving a community. They see themselves at war with our communities. And that's reinforced in training. That is one, I think, across the board problem with all departments. In addition, there is a legal doctrine called qualified immunity that has basically resulted in license for officers to violate the Constitution. And then with the Albuquerque Police Department in particular, there was a long history of what was one previous mayor's no settlement policy. And in taking this position that he was going to take every civil rights case to trial, the culture of the department was built up around that. They were preparing for trial instead of actually holding their officers accountable and ensuring that the officers were policing in the best way possible. Instead, they hid information. Their internal affairs reflected that they didn't actually want to discover or find that an officer had acted unlawfully or unconstitutionally. It just served, the whole department served to protect officers. And that culture, even though the Department of Justice has had a oversight of the department for the past 5 or so years, that has not changed the culture. It's a huge thing to turn something like that around.
Jeff, do you want to take off from there?
Yeah, I think what Laura said is some of the things are not unique to Albuquerque Police Department. There is a prevalent, first of all, police unions dominate what happens when a policeman is accused of a killing or use of excessive force. All kinds of rights come into play. The officer gets to see reports, he gets to meet with the lawyer, all kinds of things. The other thing is that we used to say about the police union in Chicago, and I think it's true everywhere, they'd never seen a case of police brutality they didn't like. Every action by the police is automatically defended by the union, politically, often financially. And the other thing you have there, like in most, is a code of silence, where even if a minority of police are actually brutal, the rest of the police cover for them and never report seeing any of the brutality. That exists in all the departments, but apparently, particularly in the Albuquerque Police Department. Another thing that Laura said, the sort of us versus them mentality, when they do get to the scene, it didn't take a sleuth to figure out that a protester had been shot in the back by a vigilante, both of whom were on the scene. The police dealt with it completely as though it was a crowd control scene. They didn't get the information on witnesses who actually saw the shooting. Fortunately, or whatever, the shooting was actually on video, and it's been widely passed out on social media that as Scott Williams was running away, he was shot in the back by Steven Baca, and he fought. You know, it's a terrible video. Originally, the police, even the police detective on the scene, the undercover agent, charged the cop, approved charges of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. Subsequently, those charges have been withdrawn, at least temporarily, and the police are claiming they need more evidence because maybe there's a self-defense defense. This is unheard of. The prosecutors don't worry normally that somebody might have a defense. Everyone has a defense. But in this case, the video speaks, makes out a pretty strong case of aggravated battery and probably attempt murder. Why you wouldn't begin with those charges when normally they overcharge people. So I think there needs to be pressure put on the prosecutor, Raul Torres, to reinitiate aggravated battery and attempt murder charges against somebody who openly on a video shoots a protester at a crowd after provoking several people.
So you have a petition out about that, don't you?
Well, there is a group that does. Color of Change has a petition out there demanding prosecution of Baca, who's currently out on a recognizance bond, charged only with aggravated battery on a woman. And I say only because compared to the shooting, he's charged with aggravated battery. Right before the shooting, he body slams a woman to the ground. And when the crowd tries to stop him from getting away, they mace him. And then eventually he pulls out.
They didn't mace him, he maced them, right?
I'm sorry, excuse me, yes. As he's departing or stepping back or taunting them, he pulls out, Baca pulls out mace and starts spraying people in the face. Baca went to that demonstration with a gun in one pocket and a can of mace in the other, and immediately started provoking people. So if he's claiming self-defense, we would say that he provoked the situation, and the self-defense really doesn't apply in that situation.
Okay, well listen, I need to remind our listeners that they're listening to KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station, and today I'm speaking with Laura Ives, the attorney representing Scott Williams, who while protesting in Albuquerque was shot by Steven Baca, and with Jeff Haas, who has devoted an entire career to litigating cases involving racial and environmental justice. So we'll get back to that conversation now. Mayor Keller has announced a plan to create a public safety division or department within the city. And they would hire professional counselors, therapists, mediators, and so forth, who would then respond to calls related to homelessness, mental health, and drug use. I don't think domestic violence was listed as part of that list of responses. While this would do nothing to fix the Albuquerque Police Department, it would seem to be a good decision and a step in the right direction that might be considered by other jurisdictions. What do you know about this, either of you?
I think it's a good step in the right direction, but it's a small step. I mean, we're trying to unravel, 100 years of building up a system that ensures the subjugation of people in poverty and people of color. And so until we address that many of the things that we've criminalized and many of the things that we put people in jail for are not actually crimes, and they're symptomatic of our failure to do the right thing in the first instance, we're going to continue to face these problems. We have to do better. I mean, we're constantly attempting to fix things at the wrong end. If we do the right thing at the outset, if we don't create conditions of massive disparity, if we don't create conditions of desperation and addiction, we wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing. And so it's a start. It's a Band-Aid on what is a really sick system. And we can, attempt to work within it, but the whole thing needs upended.
Jeff, did you have anything to add?
Well, I think the emphasis, as Laura said, I think part of defunding the police is funding the agencies that would give people the services so the police don't have to be called to deal with some of the issues that you mentioned. So, and the other obviously is really training and de-escalating. How do you use the minimum force to deal with the situation, not what the law might allow you to, or what you get angry when your authority might be challenged by somebody who's got a mental health problem, and you see that as a challenge to your authority, and you continue to escalate. And that's what we see in a lot of these police murder situations. When somebody doesn't respond quite immediately, and particularly if they're a person of color, the policeman feels like they're entitled to use their gun to bring the person under control or kill them, as we've seen in many situations.
Yeah, it was pretty shocking when you saw the George Floyd video and police just walking around watching him kill him, and people telling him he's killing them, and they just did nothing. It was appalling. But it does seem like what Keller's proposing would at least reduce the instances of police showing up in cases where you don't need an armed police officer, you need a counselor. So, but what I'm wondering about though is what could be done. Laura, you were saying it's a Band-Aid. What can be done to transform the Albuquerque culture and its practices? I've read that Camden, New Jersey basically fired their entire police department and rehired an entirely new force. If all else fails, could that be a solution, or what is something somewhat shy of firing everyone?
I mean, all else has failed. We have attempted, a million different fixes to this, and we're attempting to work within a system that is broken. And so, in fact, after my law firm, we represented the estate of James Matthew Boyd. And he was a homeless, mentally ill camper in Albuquerque who was killed on the mountainside. And thankfully, there was lapel footage of it. They thought it looked totally justified. But in any event, following that killing, the Albuquerque Police Department instituted the Coast Unit, which is something similar to what Mayor Keller has proposed here. And really, I just think if you don't attempt to structurally address every bit of this, that we are enforcing laws that we should just not, there are a myriad of other ways to deal with everything we consider to be a societal ill. And if we criminalize everything and we just want this to be a police state, we'll continue on the road that we're on. And if we want to do something different, we should look at the incredible success in New Jersey. I mean, it's remarkable. And so, you know, how exactly that plays out, Jeff may be able to better speak to that. I'm not working specifically on defunding the police efforts, but I absolutely think that our money is spent best elsewhere, and that we can prevent a lot of what concerns everybody. All of our lives can be improved if we're treating people with decency, if we're spending money and caring for people when we should be, instead of waiting till everybody's desperate and or homeless. You know, you need to deal with it on the front end, and that's what we should be doing.
Jeff, did you have any thoughts on that in terms of systemic the whole thing about defund the police? I wish they had a different name for it, because you know, there are people out there who would say, hey, if I'm getting raped or, you know, someone's breaking into my house, I don't need a counselor. There are certainly instances when someone with some form of force or authority is introduced. But what could be done to under the umbrella of defund police that might be palatable to the public?
Yeah, I don't think defund the police means when there's a violent crime being perpetrated that you need somebody with authority and force to respond to that. And defund the police is really dealing with a lot of other situations that police are not the right person. You don't need a person with a gun in a mental health situation or a homeless situation, maybe in certain drug situations. So you put your money in the societal solutions to those things. On the other hand, some of the things that you can do is limit the power of police unions to determine who gets disciplined. Why aren't disciplinary complaints public? Why aren't, if you've got 3 disciplinary complaints, maybe you should be you should be considered for being fired? Why isn't that, you know, that should be public? 3 complaints should require review. There should be training in de-escalation. We need laws against chokeholds, against hog tying, against police practices that allow police to put people in dangerous situations. We also have to, I think, investigate the penetration of police department by right-wing extremists. We've seen the head of the police union in Minneapolis was pretty close to a right-wing extremist, and I'm sure that we're worried about that. We need to not allow armed people to come to demonstrations and menace protesters. I know that's a state law about open carry, but it's ridiculous, particularly when the only authority on the scene is these militiamen who've decided in this case they want to protect the statute and actually will use force as they see fit to against protesters. And it creates a really chaotic attitude, and it also allows a vigilante like Baca to feel like, well, I'm free. If the only person with a gun here are those guys, I can throw women to the ground and maybe even shoot and mace people, and who's gonna care? The militia didn't certainly step in there. So I think there are a lot of things that can be done by police departments. Well,
Jeff, we're going to get back to that in just a minute, but we are out of time for the live show. And so I want to say goodbye to our listeners. We'll be back next week with another show of Retake Our Democracy. And if you're interested in what we're talking about, we're going to extend the conversation, and it'll be available at retakeourdemocracy.org. You just click on the, go to our homepage and go to the menu, Actions and Events menu. And once you get there, just click on Retake Conversations and you'll get to this show. So thank you very much, Laura and Jeff. And we'll just be quiet for 5 seconds or so, and then we'll resume the podcast. Okay, well, we can be a little more casual now because it's not on the radio, it's just on the, I was interested in what you were saying, Jeff, about the defund the police. It's, you know, and I want to get back to you're talking about the need for training and so forth. It seems like it's got to get even beyond that, because when you look at the video of that Floyd case murder, there's such a sense of entitlement. And I don't remember the name of the African-American jogger who was shot in the back when he was running by three folks who were clearly
Arbery.
Yes, and now they've been charged. But when he came, there was an article I read recently that talked about the physical language, the body language of the people who commit these things is such that it's like they're doing the right thing and they're putting these people in their place and they're entitled to do this. And that speaks to even more than police training. What is wrong with these people who, I remember thinking almost all of the people who are in the police department, or a large number of them, come right out of the military. And so there's this mentality, and Laura, you talked a bit about that, that it's we versus us, but it's also this thing of like, I have power and it's power over you. How does that dynamic play out, and how can we undo it?
I mean, the federal courts have told them over and over and over again they do have the power, and they haven't been held accountable for unconstitutional acts. And that gets back to what is a very serious issue of qualified immunity. And there's a body of case law outlining some of the most horrific police actions that you could imagine, where police officers are granted immunity because there was not a case exactly like that previously. And so they have every reason to feel emboldened. I mean, it is a culture, right? There's a culture of who is interested and drawn to police work. And I actually, as Jeff said, like there are certain instances where you need somebody well-trained and able to address a violent crime. But it does attract people who have sort of a military mentality, and what keeps that in check are our laws and oversight, and that is failing right now. And so they have every reason to feel emboldened, and we need to fight with all we can to ensure that body of law no longer governs officer conduct. And we need to fight that, whether or not somebody can sue or not, our institutions should not be operating just in the sense of what their liability is. They should be operating in the best interest of the community, and that's not what they're doing.
Jeff, did you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the George Floyd killing, and everybody's seen it, and the look on the cop's face as he was kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, somebody described it as he's just looking almost defiantly, like, you got a problem? Is sort of his look, like, is something wrong? You got a problem with what I'm doing here? Just like almost challenging the spectators and the people with the camera to challenge what he did. And that kind of attitude, and also knowing that the underlings with him wouldn't go against what he was doing, even though some of them obviously knew it was way wrong. The code of silence and his seniority allowed him to think he could get away with that. And then you take this situation, and Laura's talking about immunity for cops who shoot people or use excessive force. And this case we have right now this is a vigilante who used excessive force on a protester. And the equivalent of not charging him is giving him immunity. And we mentioned the fact that, as I said, I represent witnesses. The reason witnesses are hesitant are because at the scene they offered to come forward and their names weren't taken. When the police took over the scene, they were hostile to the crowd. They didn't deal with the fact that they had a potential homicide. Who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? What's happening here? Instead, the whole crowd became the enemy. Then the prosecutor brings and then drops charges against people. And then people are fearful of retaliation by this civil patrol and some of the social media that they do. And gaslighting people. This so-and-so lives here. Threats on people who do come forward. Now, I think in this case, there's a greater risk of Baca not being prosecuted to the movement. If he can get away with shooting somebody in the back, then I think it's open season on protesters. So I just think the prosecutor hasn't done much, or the police, to give people confidence that if they came forward, they would be protected and this would be a serious prosecution. And that's what they do, of course, when a policeman is prosecuted as well, or not prosecuted.
So, you know, that's the police department. The other, Baca's case was vigilantism. The case in which the African-American jogger was shot in the back and killed was clearly a case of vigilantism. And this is something that is being promoted, or we're seeing a real surge in this, but it's also not something that doesn't have its antecedents in everything from the colonization of the United States to slavery and Jim Crow. How is it that we've grown now to seem to tolerate or even encourage this kind of unbridled violence?
I think that's how it's best characterized, as unbridled violence. There, in this particular instance, and in the instance in Georgia, there was no vigilantism. My client wasn't doing anything unlawful. Mr. Baca is the one doing something unlawful. And so that there's this clash of people who want to hold on to the racist institutions that we have in place, between the people who are demanding change, and that they are arming themselves and injuring people in the process. That's something, as Jeff said, we have to take very, very, very seriously. And to characterize it as vigilantism, I think, is unfair to what it is. I think they're waging war against people who want to improve this society and want to have a real conversation about systemic institutional racism. And that's causing a lot of upheaval. And officers and law enforcement, who's a part of that structure, and not every individual, right? But the structure certainly supports systemic racism, and everybody within that structure feels threatened and angry. And this is the reaction we're seeing. And if we don't stop it, as Jeff said, nobody's going to be safe protesting. Nobody's going to be safe airing their grievances. And our ability to push this and improve our society will be even harder than it was 4 months ago.
Do you have anything to add to that, Jeff?
Well, I think what you said, it is becoming more and more of a national phenomenon. We learned that Army person shot and killed 2 law enforcement people at a demonstration, and a barbecue owner, a member of the community, was killed. So this is prevalent. I think the white racist, white supremacist attitude, which is supported by the White House and many of Trump's supporters, gives those people the belief that, you know, they're a movement and they're trying to take the country backwards. And so as people move forward and get rid of symbols of conquer and racism like Onate, they feel threatened by that. And Baca's not an unknown quality. He ran for city council in Albuquerque very much on a law and order platform. There should be no restrictions on people's right to carry guns. That's who he is. And interestingly, when the police finally did come after the shooting, the first thing he says to them is, "My father worked in the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office." Like, I'm a cop, I'm in law enforcement, give me a pass. And they have so far.
So we have seen, as a result of primarily the George Floyd murder, that there has been this almost knee-jerk, well, more than a knee-jerk response, a response nationwide, both a shift in the public discourse about police violence, and I haven't seen polls, but I suspect in the polling, about people's attitudes about that. I've seen polling that there's support for the protests in a surprisingly large numbers. But you know, we've seen that pattern before, whether it's in relation to school mass shootings, where instantly people are going to go and do things and then nothing happens. And we've seen it in relation to police violence in the past, and the same thing. But is there something fundamentally different about this? And should we expect that the momentum is going to continue and we're going to be seeing more and more police reform efforts?
As somebody who was active in the protests of the 60s, I think this is different. It's more it's more sustained. It's more national. It's more people, white people. It's more intergenerational. It seems to have captured the imagination and beliefs of more and more people. When you see the professional sports acknowledging police brutality, when you see Confederate statues coming down, which have been targets for 100 years and exposed as not heritage symbols, but symbols of race, of white supremacy, which is exactly what they are. I think you see the beginning of real change and real dialogue, and maybe even the issue of reparations begins to get raised about what is our racist history. So I really think the potential is there for it being a moment where significant change in both police departments and the society. We've seen the virus show the inequalities in healthcare. We've seen who gets laid off. You know, those things are, you can't put it back. You can't unsee something. And so many people, I think, have. So I'm somewhat hopeful that this movement is going to result in some real change.
Laura, are you skeptical?
I'm kind of a skeptic by nature, but I'm hopeful too. I mean, there's been a dramatic shift in public opinion. Lapel cameras are no panacea. We should have been taking the word of communities of color for the past, 100 years of what law enforcement has been doing to them. But lapel cameras have exposed that. And I think even the most, many of the most cruel observers can't deny what was on the George Floyd video. And like Jeff said, seeing the officer's face, like, I am not accountable. This is going to be okay. And when you watch that, you know what that guy's done time and time and time again to the community that he was supposed to be serving in. So I think it's for people to see that at this moment. I think it has struck a conversation that I've been asked about qualified immunity by journalists, multiple times in the past month, is extraordinary. We're having conversations that we hadn't been having, and people are having the conversations who'd never had them before, and that's hopeful.
Yeah, and it doesn't look like it's going away. It really doesn't. And so I think it is, in some fashion, it's this cascading of events that, like Jeff said, has exposed the health system, the economic system, our political system. The extent to which racism is not just accepted, but promoted from the White House. I mean, all of that is starting to coalesce around, like, okay, we've got to do something dramatically different. And that's a good segue into our last two questions. The next question is, Retake takes the position, and it's almost an assumption, that the same systems, and actually this resonates with what you were saying earlier, Laura, the same systems that have created the problems, whether they're the economic, the health, the capitalist system, isn't going to be this kind of, it's not going to fix itself. So we're going to need to invent an entirely new system, new set of systems. And we've come to talking about that as a new normal. What would you see, and we'll start with Laura and then go to Jeff, what would you see as being like a new normal you could anticipate and support?
I mean, a new normal would provide healthcare and mental health care to everybody. A new normal would give everybody the same educational opportunities. A new normal would not treat people, based on this kind of flawed meritocracy. A new normal, the criminal justice system, we wouldn't criminalize basic issues of poverty. We wouldn't start funneling children into prison when they're in school. We would accept, and with respect to policing in particular, law enforcement in particular, we would take seriously the crimes that need to be taken seriously. I mean, right now, there are so many, there's 200 serial rapists on the streets of Albuquerque that are identified, and they're not prosecuted. And instead, somewhere today, somebody's getting kicked off a park bench. So the stuff that matters, we need to take seriously.
What about you, Jeff?
Well, I think all of the issues that Laura suggested, healthcare and education, are really important. And I would add to that the issue of climate, the fact that capitalism is not, and the fossil fuel industry is not going to solve the climate problem. And I think the issue of income inequality is really important. How come Jeff Bezos make $30 billion during the COVID crisis and pay no taxes? It's crazy. So we need a system where government has the resources to use for people's programs. And that's not going to happen without drastic changes on who has the money and who has the control and who determines who gets elected. So we need big changes in all of those things. I think we saw a few of those. A couple of very progressive people got elected in New York Tuesday night. That was really exciting. People who are standing up against the current criminal justice system for the Green New Deal.
And I don't know if you saw this, Jeff, but Booker is now leading McGrath in Kentucky.
Oh my God. Well, there you go. I just think all of those could be, symbols of where more and more people are. So those positions have to become mainstream. And certainly the Democratic Party has not adopted them. In many cases, all those three candidates were opposed by the Democratic leadership. And yet they present, I think, the biggest hope for our future.
What about you, Laura? Are you optimistic about the future?
I have to be. Yeah, I mean, that's you've got to be to keep fighting. And there's the voice of the country, like you said, pushed by sort of the most open racism and hatred that we've experienced in our lifetimes as a general community, right? Obviously, it's just more, it's always existed, but now there's somebody in the White House sponsoring it. And so that feels very different. And I think it's inspired people to take seriously what they should have been taking seriously before. But we're here now, and we're having a much better, more informed conversation than we've ever had, and at least acknowledging the reality of the disparities in our society, acknowledging the systemic racism, acknowledging how that impacts people is a good step. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in November.
What about you, Jeff? Are you optimistic?
Well, I think there's some issues that are systemic that need drastic change immediately, like healthcare, like education, and in particular climate, that we really need to change the system. Other things I think don't have such short time limits on it, perhaps, although I think Black people and people of color are pushing us. We want the change now. We deserve the change. We've been waiting hundreds of years, and they demand change. I think climate requires a complete change in our economic system very, very rapidly. One that invests in social services, not in materialism, not in war. We need to change those fundamental things. somebody said, let's cut the war budget by 50%, and we could do all the programs we're talking about and probably be in a much safer world right now. So I think all those things are connected, but they need fundamental change.
And are you optimistic that can happen?
I want that to happen, and I feel like we all need to commit our lives the best way we can to making it happen. I don't do that because I think we'll necessarily succeed, but I think it's something we have to do. And I'm hoping, and maybe we give humanity, humanity 50 more years of life on the planet. Is that what we're fighting for? Or, who knows what the ultimate will be, or for particularly people in the most vulnerable parts of the world, we really can't say, well, ultimately we're going to lose, so we're not going to do anything about your current situation. So, I think the details are scary about climate in particular, but all these issues. And I think we just have to do what we can to bring about this kind of change we're talking about. And that's being demanded of people of color and listening to them. If we listen to Native American people and people of color, if we had been listening for a long time, we would not be the country we are right now.
Okay, well, what do you think is going to happen in November? Are we going to ditch this guy?
My feeling is yes. I think, as somebody said, he's setting his flag way behind where people have gotten, and he only has a one-act thing, and that's to be more white racist and white supremacist. And I think at this moment that's not going to work even so well among white people, and certainly not among people of color. What he'll do, to save his job and to save his power, I don't, that scares me. I don't think he'll get voted in again.
What about you, Laura?
I hope Jeff's right. And, going back to kind of hope generally and what matters, kind of predicting the future. I go through this exercise. It's an absurd exercise with clients all the time, where we're valuing their loved one's life. And we talk about, if somebody could have one last time that they're tucking their child into bed, or one last dinner with their mom or brother, would they take, $1 billion for that? They wouldn't. And so whatever the future, we need to try our best in the moment, and we need to treat people as decently as we can. Every moment matters, and we just need to do our best in it. And whether he's in the White House or not, whether this is fixed or not, we just have to keep trying.
Okay. Well, thank you both. You've taken way more time than we anticipated for this. And so it's been a very interesting conversation. I want to thank you both and wish you well with your work. And do keep us informed, Retake informed, so that we can continue to promote what you're doing and support it. And with that in mind, we'll be having on our website, by the time anyone listens to this, the petition that you're asking people to sign to encourage the Albuquerque district attorney to press charges more assertively. And thank you very much for taking the time, and good luck with your work.
Thank you.
I think, yes, signing the petition is good. Somebody suggested, should we be calling the prosecutor, Raul Torres, and saying, prosecute Steven Baca? Yes, I think people should do that too.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Thank you both. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paul.